Open the Imperial ledger, and the first line item is not development. It is revenue reliability, the public story order, modernization, rule of law, free trade. Infrastructure functions as a cover sheet for that ledger. The colony is described as a project it receives courts, police, ports, surveys, rail, standardized weights, and a predictable administration. The implied bargain is simple: these upgrades are the dividend. So the colony must responsibly finance the apparatus that delivers them. In that framing, taxation is not extraction. It is the entrance fee for institutional adulthood. But the arithmetic underneath is indifferent to the language above it. A growth balance sheet asks whether an economy is thickening its capital base or surpluses staying long enough to become machines. Irrigation, factories, local finance, skills, and fiscal capacity that compounds. The colonial balance sheet is not built to answer that question. It is built to answer a narrower one: can this territory produce a stable, transferable surplus, a net remittance without threatening metropolitan creditor confidence? Once that becomes the governing metric, order stops meaning domestic development and starts meaning payment certainty. The illusion is produced by renaming the same mechanism at each stage of the cycle. A tax system that prioritizes collectability becomes efficient administration. A budget that privileges collection, coercion, and trade facilitation becomes modern governance. A transport network optimized for moving export commodities to ports becomes connectivity. A trade regime that opens local markets while capturing margins elsewhere becomes free trade. Each label is technically defensible in isolation. Together they form a narrative that substitutes institutional aesthetics for balance sheet accumulation. The cleanest concealment is the conflation of throughput with compounding. Railways can raise volumes. Ports can accelerate circulation. Courts can reduce certain transaction costs. None of these automatically increases the share of surplus that remains inside the colony to finance diversification. A system can become highly legible, highly policed, and highly connected, and still be structurally prevented from converting increased output into domestic capital formation. In ledger terms, you can increase the speed of flows while keeping the direction of net flows unchanged. The colony can look busier while staying poorer in cumulative terms. The phrase "the colony must pay for itself" is the pivot where prestige overrides arithmetic. It sounds like prudence. In practice, it imposes a hard constraint: the colonial state must fund itself locally and maintain external credibility, which means prioritizing the kinds of revenues that are schedulable, enforceable, and convertible into external claims. This shifts the meaning of taxation from a tool of development to a tool of monetization under compulsion. When subsistence households are pushed into cash obligations on fixed dates, the economy is forced to route production through markets whether or not the terms are favorable. Cash becomes not a convenience, but a necessity. And necessity is the most reliable engine of compliance. From the outside, this can be misread as market creation. From the inside, it is a forced conversion of livelihood into settlement capacity. Households do not enter the cash economy to accumulate, they enter it to clear a bill. Once the tax calendar becomes the dominant rhythm, production choices tilt toward whatever can be sold quickly, even if it is fragile to global prices. The state is then able to claim that exports are evidence of progress, while the deeper function is to generate taxable, remittable surplus. The illusion is sustained because some benefits are real but strategically partial. Roads and rail exist, paper administration exists, legal uniformity exists, yet these are often designed to reduce the transaction costs of extraction mapping land to tax it, standardizing property to collateralize it, policing movement to discipline labor, building ports to move bulk commodities, and maintaining courts that secure contracts aligned with imperial commerce. The system does not need to ruin a colony to keep it poor in a compounding sense. It only needs to keep the surplus liquid and exportable, and keep domestic credit formation thin. So the decisive misdirection is conceptual colonial governance is sold as a development plan, but it behaves like a remittance engine. The colony is treated not as a balance sheet to grow, but as a cash flow source to stabilize something elsewhere: metropolitan budgets, bond markets, import needs, and the political economy of creditors. Once you accept that underlying objective, the surface narrative stops being confusing. It becomes functional. The next step is to stop reading the slogans and trace the plumbing: how taxes force cash settlement, how trade privilege captures spreads, how currency and credit arrangements ration domestic investment, and how multiple charges convert local revenue into external claims. That is where the illusion becomes a mechanism. To move from the public story to the working mechanism. Start with the constraint the colony could not evade a cash settlement schedule. Land revenue assessments, customs duties, exes, and poll-style levies were not just ways to raise funds. They were devices that forced subsistence into monetization on fixed dates. A household that could previously balance risk in kind now had to obtain coin or paper at the tax deadline, which meant selling output or labor when the market was least forgiving. In a downturn, the obligation did not disappear. It merely changed the form of payment into arrears, distress sales, or the liquidation of land rights. The state's order was therefore not a neutral improvement in administration. It was a conversion engine. It translated life and harvest into liquid cash that could be counted, transferred, and pledged. Once cash exists under compulsion, the next question is where the spread is captured. The trade regime did not need an explicit, permanent monopoly to behave monopolistically. It only needed control over high-margin functions and rule setting. Shipping, insurance, warehousing, finance, port regulation, licensing, and procurement networks set disproportionately in metropolitan hands or under metropolitan standards. The colony could export, but it exported primarily goods with volatile prices and limited pricing power, while importing manufactures priced with higher markups and protected cost structures. The crucial point is that free trade can be formally present while the distribution of value is structurally predetermined. The colony supplies the bulky, price-taking end. The metropole supplies the price-setting, margin-taking end. Increased throughput then becomes compatible with declining local bargaining power, because volume can rise even as the local share of the surplus shrinks. Currency and credit complete the lock. A tax system that demands cash creates demand for money, but the capacity to create credit determines whether monetization becomes accumulation or merely compliance. Banking and monetary arrangements linked to the Imperial Center could expand credit for export flows, government paper, and merchant trade, while rationing longer-term domestic investment that would generate competing industries and political autonomy. Exchange arrangements designed to protect external convertibility, privileged settlement in metropolitan terms over local liquidity management. The economy is allowed enough liquidity to keep taxes and exports functioning, but not enough autonomous credit creation to thicken domestic capital formation. In ledger language, the colony's money supply is treated as a servicing tool, not a development instrument. Then the transfer channels turn this architecture into a net remittance machine. Administrative home charges, salaries paid abroad, pensions, interest on debt issued in London, and mandated imports from British suppliers convert local taxation and local production into external income streams. Even when expenditures occur locally, procurement rules and contractor structures can route a large fraction back to metropolitan firms. So public spending recycles outward through invoices rather than compounding inward through domestic supply chains. These pipes matter because they make outflow automatic once cash is collected and trade earnings are realized. Multiple standing claims sit ahead of local reinvestment. The colony's surplus becomes easier to export than to retain, easier to service than to compound, and once that is true, the system's governing imperative becomes non-negotiable. Collections must remain stable, because stability is what keeps every upstream claim credible. That imperative is where the plumbing hardens into the trap that follows. The plumbing described earlier does not remain a neutral set of channels. It hardens into a rule of governance. Once the system is built around monetized taxes, privileged margins, and external settlement, the colony is no longer managed for growth. It is managed for solvency, not the colony's solvency in a developmental sense, but the solvency of the remittance chain that sits above it. The decisive constraint is simple: revenue must be collected on time and in transferable form. Because late collection is not merely an administrative failure, it is a threat to the credibility of every external claim that has been layered onto the colony's cash flow. That priority produces a fiscal stance that is mechanically pro-cyclical. Assessments and obligations tend to be sticky downward, while household incomes are not. When harvests fail or world prices fall, the tax calendar still arrives. The state can choose to reduce pressure and accept lower collections, but doing so jeopardizes the very object the system is tuned to protect: stable remittance and metropolitan confidence. So the system defaults to enforcement rather than adjustment. The budget behaves like a fixed coupon instrument. It demands cash in bad years as in good years, forcing the private sector to absorb volatility through reduced consumption. Asset sales, and labor migration. In ledger terms, the Treasury stabilizes its own line by destabilizing the balance sheets beneath it. Land is then converted from a livelihood platform into collateral for the tax machine. Surveys, registries, and standardized property rules are presented as modernization. Yet their operational value is to make the tax base legible and enforceable. When cash must be raised to meet assessments, households borrow against future output or against land itself. When shocks hit, arrears do not merely accumulate. They trigger auctions, foreclosures, and transfers of control to creditors who can service the tax demand more reliably. This is not an accidental abuse of a good system. It is an endogenous stabilizer. The tax regime creates a predictable sequence obligation, borrowing distress transfer. The state receives its payment, and the risk is pushed into private insolvency. A territory can thus remain orderly while its productive class becomes structurally thin, because order is defined as settlement, not as resilience. The export circuit intensifies the trap rather than loosening it. If taxes compel cash, export crops become the fastest route to cash, even when they increase exposure to external prices. Households and regions shift toward whatever clears the tax bill most predictably, which deepens dependence on global demand cycles. When prices fall, the response is rarely to protect incomes. It is to sell more volume, cutting deeper into local bargaining power. The colony becomes a price taker twice over first in the market for its exports, and second in the credit market that finances the gap between harvest and tax date. This is how participation in world trade can coexist with chronic underaccumulation. The export machine expands, but the gains are pre-claimed by the settlement hierarchy. Meanwhile, domestic compounding remains thin because the system's incentives reject the creation of rival accumulation centers. Local industry requires patient credit, protective policy space, and public spending that favors local supply chains. A remittance-oriented regime prefers the opposite short-maturity trade finance, procurement that routes to metropolitan firms, and infrastructure that reduces the cost of moving taxable output outward. Even when investment occurs, it is often structured as an external claim, capital imported with interest, guarantees, and repatriation, so the balance sheet thickens elsewhere. The colony's apparent modernization can therefore be real in physical form. While still failing as an accumulation process, the assets do not anchor a self-reinforcing domestic credit and industry loop. The trap is complete when stability becomes its own justification. Because the system is tuned to protect external credibility, it treats local distress as acceptable noise, so long as collections clear. At that point, the question is no longer whether the colony produces wealth, but who is forced to absorb the losses required to keep the remittance machine smooth. That incidents how volatility is assigned downward through prices, wages, debt, and coercion is the next layer of the autopsy. Once solvency becomes the governing target, the system needs a shock absorber. It finds one in the lowest bargaining power balance sheets households, small producers, and local merchants. The fiscal line is kept smooth by pushing volatility downward. When export prices fall or harvests fail, the Treasury does not automatically shrink its claims. Instead, the private sector is forced to clear the same cash calendar with less cash available. The adjustment therefore expresses itself as compressed consumption, higher informal interest rates, and accelerated asset liquidation. In accounting terms, the state stabilizes its receipts by converting macro shocks into micro insolvencies. This transfer works through predictable instruments. First is distress sale grain. Livestock, tools, and land rights are sold at cyclical lows to meet tax and debt dates. Second is wage compression. Labor supply rises as households search for cash, weakening bargaining power and lowering real wages even when nominal wages hold. Third is debt deepening. Short maturity borrowing bridges the gap between harvest and settlement, turning seasonal cash needs into permanent interest burdens. Each instrument moves the same quantity of required cash toward the collector while thinning the capacity of producers to reinvest, upgrade, or endure the next shock. The pain is not an accident. It is the mechanism by which revenue reliability is maintained under uncertainty. Administrative spending can appear to counterbalance extraction, but its structure often reinforces outward recycling. A budget can spend heavily and still fail to build domestic multipliers if procurement, expertise, and high-wage employment are imported or externally paid. Even developmental line items can operate as pass-throughs, rail and port contracts awarded to metropolitan firms, equipment purchased abroad, senior salaries, pensions, and interest serviced externally, materials and rolling stock imported rather than locally produced. The colony sees activity construction, payrolls, logistics, while the net effect on domestic capital formation remains muted because the high-value nodes of the spending chain sit outside the territory. The ledger looks busy, the compounding remains thin. Trade policy and market structure then allocate pain asymmetrically between sectors. When local manufacturers face competition without equivalent access to credit, protection, or state procurement, the adjustment takes the form of deindustrialization, pressure workshops close, artisans are displaced, and labor is pushed back into lower productivity agriculture or into export crop circuits. This is not primarily ideological. It is a consequence of rule setting that makes imported manufactures the default and limits the policy instruments that could shelter learning and scale. The economy's risk-bearing capacity shrinks as it is concentrated into a narrow base of primary production exposed to global prices and weather. Famine and crisis dynamics are the extreme expression of the same allocation logic. A system can record adequate aggregate output while still producing local scarcity if households must sell food to obtain cash and repay obligations. Liquidity becomes more binding than calories. Food moves to where cash can pay, not where need is greatest. Under those conditions, market functioning is compatible with social collapse, because the market is serving settlement priorities rather than resilience. By the time this incidence pattern is entrenched, stability becomes fragile in a specific way. It depends on continued compliance and continued ability to externalize losses. The next stressor, war finance, a global commodity crash, or a credit tightening does not merely reduce incomes. It tests whether the settlement machine can keep clearing without tearing its own enforcement and legitimacy costs above the value of the remittance it was built to deliver. The breaking point arrives when the system's hidden objective is stable. Transferable surplus meets conditions that make stability expensive. The model assumes that revenue can be collected with tolerable enforcement costs and that external settlement can be maintained without political rupture. A large shock breaks that assumption by forcing the regime to choose between two incompatible forms of credibility: credibility with metropolitan creditors and credibility with the population whose balance sheets are being used as shock absorbers. War finance is a classic stress test because it expands claims while narrowing the margin for adjustment. Military expenditure rises to procurement intensifies. Shipping capacity is diverted, and import prices can spike. The remittance logic does not pause. It becomes more insistent. If the colony is expected to fund a larger share of the apparatus while export conditions deteriorate, the tax and trade machine must extract more cash from a population with less ability to pay. Enforcement costs rise, arrears swell, and the political price of collection increases. What was previously framed as administrative order becomes visible as coercive settlement. A global commodity crash produces a different but equally lethal arithmetic. Export revenues fall sharply, while cash obligations remain sticky. Households respond by selling more volume to chase the same nominal tax bill, which deepens price declines and accelerates distress. The state can respond with relief, rescheduling, or tax reductions, but those remedies reduce collections and therefore threaten the system's external commitments. If it chooses relief, it risks the appearance of fiscal weakness. If it chooses extraction, it risks social breakdown and escalating security costs. Either path erodes the central advantage. The model was designed to produce low-cost surplus transfer. Credit tightening is the third stressor because it reveals dependency on external liquidity. When trade finance contracts or exchange conditions worsen, the colony cannot easily substitute domestic credit at scale if its financial architecture has been kept thin. The state and merchant sector then ration imports, compress demand, and intensify collection to defend external payments. Austerity becomes the automatic stabilizer. That response may preserve nominal settlement for a time, but it also shrinks the economic base that generates revenue, turning solvency policy into a self-reinforcing contraction. At the breaking point, prestige can no longer cover the bill. The narrative of modernization relies on the assumption that the state's claims are legitimate because they are developmental. Under severe stress, the population experiences the claims not as development, but as extraction with deteriorating returns. Resistance rises, compliance falls, and the cost of maintaining order increases faster than the surplus being transferred. The model then faces an internal rate of return problem. The marginal unit of remittance requires a disproportionately larger unit of coercion and administrative expenditure. The system does not collapse in a single moment. It flips regimes. What had been an efficient settlement machine becomes a contested, expensive one. Once that happens, the same architecture that produced reliable outflows leaves behind a difficult inheritance, a tax apparatus built for enforcement, a trade structure built for primary exports, and a financial system built for external settlement, precisely the starting conditions that make post-imperial balance sheet repair so hard. When formal control loosens or ends, the arithmetic does not vanish with the flag. What persists is the inherited machinery and the path dependence it created. A post-colonial state often receives a fiscal apparatus optimized for collectability, not for broad-based development, narrow tax handles, coercive collection habits, and administrative competence concentrated in revenue extraction and internal security. It also inherits an economy shaped by the earlier settlement imperatives, a large share of employment in low-productivity agriculture, export sectors biased toward primary commodities, and domestic industry that is either thin or structurally dependent on imported inputs, capital goods, and foreign exchange. In balance sheet terms, independence frequently begins with a state that has claims to enforce but lacks the productive base and financial instruments to expand without recreating the same pressures on households. The first constraint is the external one, now expressed through new labels. The remittance pipes may change owners from home charges to sovereign debt service, from mandated procurement to import dependence priced in hard currency, but the direction of pressure can remain similar. A country that must import fuel, machinery, and intermediate goods needs foreign exchange. If its export basket remains concentrated in commodities with volatile prices, the currency becomes a recurring choke point. In downturns, policymakers face a familiar choice: defend external payments through austerity and tight money, or loosen and risk a currency and inflation shock. Either option taxes the domestic economy's capacity to invest. The state that once had little monetary autonomy can regain sovereignty on paper and still live under an external settlement constraint in practice. The second constraint is domestic credit formation. A society forced into monetization for settlement does not automatically emerge with deep, patient finance for accumulation. Banks and capital markets may remain oriented toward short-term trade finance, government paper, and collateralized lending, because those are the safest assets in an environment of commodity volatility and political uncertainty. Long-term industrial credit risk-bearing, technology upgrading, scale building requires institutions that were not allowed to mature under an extraction-first regime. This creates a circular dependence without domestic industry and productivity growth. The tax base remains narrow. With a narrow tax base, the state leans on the same coercive handles. With coercive handles, political stability and investment confidence weaken. With weak confidence, finance stays short-term and defensive. The old settlement logic reproduces itself as a domestic equilibrium. The third constraint is institutional ideology embedded in procedures. A revenue-centric state tends to treat citizens as taxpayers to be disciplined rather than as balance sheets to be strengthened. That orientation shapes policy, prioritizing immediate collections over countercyclical relief, prioritizing visible infrastructure over quiet productivity investments, prioritizing import capacity for elites and the state over capital deepening for small producers. None of this requires bad intentions. It is the inertial outcome of inherited incentives and administrative muscle memory. Repair, in structural terms, means reversing the original identity, converting net outflow into net domestic compounding. That requires keeping more surplus inside the economy long enough to become capital through industrial policy, domestic procurement, financial deepening, and sometimes controls that manage external settlement pressure. But the very tools needed for that reversal, credible long-term finance, policy coordination capacity, and a stable social contract are what the extraction regime left underbuilt. So the permanent poverty outcome is not a timeless curse. It is an equilibrium produced by a past ledger design that optimized for transfer and then handed the successor state a machine calibrated for settlement. Not accumulation. The romance ends where the arithmetic begins if a territory is run as a remitting asset. It will exit that period with thin compounding capacity. And rebuilding compounding is a slower project than building the pipes that exported it.